My name is Ashley Hampton, and I am here today with Judee Showalter. It's June 11th at Randolph-Macon College. So what made you decide to attend Randolph-Macon, and how did you hear of Randolph-Macon?
My family moved to Virginia in 1977, and my father was transferred. He worked for a subsidiary of Reynolds-Metal, which is headquartered here. And my sister was going to be a college freshman, and she had been planning on attending Cal State Long Beach. We were from Long Beach, California. But when the family was transferred, she decided to come with us, and my parents were looking for a place for her to go. And a member of the Reynolds Board of Directors was on the Board of Trustees at Randolph-Macon College. And so he brought my sister up to look at it, and she ended up coming here before me. And then when I was looking to go to college, and I graduated from high school in 1980, I knew I wanted to go into the ministry, and we're United Methodist, always have been. So it being the oldest Methodist related school, it seemed kind of like a good fit. And in Virginia, a lot of the clergy that were my pastors growing up went to Randolph-Macon and then Duke. And so my thought was that I would go to Randolph-Macon and then Duke, like all the pastors before me.
What were your early impressions of Randolph-Macon when you came to the campus?
It was really different than what I was used to. Being a Californian, where everybody goes to public school, Cal State, Long Beach. There's a couple of private schools, but they're also huge, Pepperdine. So the idea of a school, and now I know there's little schools in California, but growing up I was unaware of the Claremont schools and those other smaller schools. Mm-hmm. So a school of 1,000 students was really foreign to both of us. My sister's high school was 3,000. So coming here was very different. So, but it was different, cool. The history and it was kind of like the movies that you see where people go away to these ivy-covered halls, which is not part of the California experience growing up. So it was very different than what we had grown up thinking a college or a university would look like, but very friendly, and very interested in having us come here. That was one of the impressions. It was a place that I was wanted. I did apply to other schools. I applied to JMU, which was the hot school in 1980, and all my friends were applying there, and so I applied. And I applied to William and Mary, and I applied to William and Mary because my mother is a historian and thought it was just incredibly cool. And because William and Mary I went to a small private Catholic school, and William and Mary had not accepted a Marymount graduate in the last 4 years. And so it was kind of a challenge to see if I could get them to accept me. And they did, and then I didn't go there, and my mom was really, really mad, but she got over it.
That's good. So how did you majored in religion?
I majored in religious studies.
And how did you decide on that major?
I was going into the ministry. It seemed to make sense. Actually, one of the reasons I did not go to William and Mary, when I went down to the interview there, they told me that they discouraged their pre-ministerial people from majoring in religion. They'll teach you that in seminary, mm-hmm. and you should major in something useful like business. And that was not the kind of ministry I wanted to be involved in. And I said Randolph-Macon was very excited about the idea that I wanted to be pre-ministerial, and B.J. Seymour was chairman of the religion department when I came, and she had written to me before, when I was in the application process, I was getting personal letters from the chairman of the department, which was really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add to that, a lot of what I've been reading and different interviews I've listened to, people seem to speak really highly of B.J. Seymour. You want to talk a little bit about her? And
Well, at the time I didn't know it, but of course now I do. I know that she was the first. She came to Randolph-Macon as the Dean of Women when Randolph-Macon went co-ed, and she was the first female full-time faculty member. She was the first female faculty member to be granted tenure. She was really a huge groundbreaker, and she was also quite a scholar. I mean, her knowledge of the Old and New Testament was amazing, and her specialty was in ethics, and so she taught a variety of courses, and she was just an amazing woman. She was later ordained by the Baptist in the Baptist church. She was Baptist, and when she was teaching here, she was not ordained. And then as soon as the Southern Baptists declared that they would not ordain women, she went to her pastor and asked to be ordained, and her congregation ordained her, even though the Southern Baptists told them they couldn't. And that's also kind of the kind of woman that she was. As soon as they told her she couldn't, then she wanted to do it. So that was, she was just really quite an amazing person. And my freshman year, we had January term, so like we have now, and we went to Israel with her, and that was an amazing trip. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to go when Israel was in a period of relative peace, so that we got to see a lot of things. We went up on the Golan Heights.
Wow.
They would not take kids on the Golan Heights. Now, I wouldn't, and I would not allow my child to go. But we got to see, there were still, it's Israel, and they've always been prepared for war, and there were still a lot of soldiers and things like that, but it was a fairly stable time when we were there, and so we got to see an amazing amount.
That's great. What activities and different organizations were you involved in while you were a student here at Randolph-Macon?
I was involved in what religious life there was on campus. We had a chaplain. His name was Charles Haynes. His role was fairly different from the current chaplains. I don't know if it was defined that way or it's just who Charles was. He was very interested in the social justice issues. And it was under him that some of the things we're still doing, like Habitat, the student chapter of Habitat was formed and things like that. But I tell people one of my other big memories is that I was here during apartheid being protested, and he would organize rallies to go to Washington, D.C. to protest at the South African Embassy, which was a big deal, and arrest was optional. And I never went to those because my parents would have a cow if I was arrested. But other students did. But we also had, in addition to kind of the mission-oriented activities, we had a worship council, and we did a weekly worship service at noon on Wednesdays in the campus center, and I was involved in that. Some attendance was better than others, some speakers were better than others, but we did worship at noon. And we did special services, and we used to do lessons and carols and different services in conjunction with the choir. That was always nice. Instead of just doing a Christmas concert, we'd do a lessons and carols service in Blackwell or in Duncan Memorial. So I was involved in the campus worship. There was a Bible study group on campus. It wasn't Young Life. It wasn't Campus Crusade. I don't remember who it was, but it was an organized group. And I attended one or two of those meetings, but they were a little more fundamental than I was. That was not a good fit. So I didn't do any of those kind of activities. I sang in the choir. I am a student of the Brock years. Our choir director's name was Gordon Brock, and he was fabulous. In fact, I think Gordon came with us. I think he came, or the year before. And I took the choir over from Buster Ward, who'd had it forever. And that was a fabulous experience. And my best friends are still my choir friends. They are the people that I still communicate with.
Did you go on choir tour?
We did. We toured every year during spring break. We went to Florida. We went north one year, Philadelphia maybe. And that's how we spent our spring break. There wasn't, I never did the beach thing because I was on choir tour. And then my senior year, the college had switched to May term. I think 82, 83, we switched to May term. I'm not sure when. And we went to England as a class for the choir. And that was, again, a really fabulous experience. We sang in some fabulous cathedrals and stayed in homes. We were home hosted, so we got to meet some really interesting people and had just a fabulous time traveling all over England and singing and touristing and studying, and it was really fun. It was cool.
So what was student life on campus like in general? Just kind of in broad terms, were lots of students involved in those same kind of activities, or was it the minority?
The student social life was driven by the Greek organizations, which pretty much still is, I guess. But there were Randolph-Macon in the 80s was a little different because we were all legal to drink beer. We were all legal as soon as we were 18. So there were keg parties in the fraternities every weekend, and there wasn't checking IDs and there weren't guest lists. It was much less controlled. In some ways that's bad because it was much less controlled. In some ways it's good because we got it all off on Friday night and we were done, or Saturday night, but there wasn't a lot that went on. There wasn't a lot of social life during the week. We went to a lot of fraternity and parties. I'm a charter member of the Phi Mu chapter here, and my sophomore year, what year was it? Phi Mu was chartered. And that was, and we're the first sorority. So there wasn't a sorority life before that. And we didn't have much of a role in college social life the first couple of years, because we were just getting established and having a house and those kind of things. And we started in the little house over by the tennis courts, and then we moved up to the house that the Alpha Gams are now in. And we didn't get the house on the corner until 1987, which was after I was gone, the current house. So our contribution to the social life was much more limited, although we had a good time. I mean, and I made some very good friends through that as well. I lived in Mary Branch. Dormitory Mary Branch was strictly women, which one of the things we joke about now is I didn't really get it when alums would come back and be so shocked that there was a woman in their dorm. Well, now there's men back in Mary Branch, and I can't figure out what those men are doing in my dorm, but I'm getting over it. And I lived in Mary Branch South all 4 years, lived in every corner of Mary Branch South. And the dorms played a big role in student life. I don't know if all of the dorms did. Mary Branch did. We had our own intramural teams. We had, our own social budgets. We had our own cookouts. We did a lot of dorm stuff. And after I joined Phi Mu, there was always this tension about, am I going to play volleyball for Phi Mu or the dorm? And I always played for the dorm. That's just what I did. And played on the Mary Branch South intramural teams and that kind of thing. And we played a lot of those. I don't remember what question we were on.
Just student life in general.
The other thing that was really different that I really miss is that we had formals.
Mm-hmm.
We had a winter ball that was the president's ball.
Mm-hmm.
And faculty and staff and trustees, it's kind of like the gala, only it wasn't a dinner, there wasn't a program, it was a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And you wore your formal, and you danced to big band music, and you might dance with your professor, which was a little weird, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a good social skill.
Right.
And I miss that coming back in the faculty staff role. I wish I had that opportunity to interact with students
Mm-hmm.
in that way. I said, and the gala is starting to do that, except
It's only for seniors.
I went to the first gala, and I went home with my husband, and I said, you know what was missing? Students.
Yeah.
It was fun, but if we're all about the students, why weren't they there? So that was, that's kind of, that I miss that. I miss that opportunity to interact in a bigger social picture.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that was important to us, learning how to interact socially, is to watch these people we admired do it.
Mm-hmm.
And try to emulate what they did.
Do you feel there was a lot of involvement of faculty and staff in student life, and you saw a lot of them involved on campus more than today, or the same, or?
Yeah, I think we saw them more involved. I think two things have changed. I think the change in the drinking age makes it a liability for faculty and staff to be with students when they're socializing, because you all aren't legal to drink, and if we see you drinking, we have to turn you in, and that makes us no fun to have.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to see it, because that puts us in the position of deciding, do we turn them in or not? So I think that's been a real detriment to faculty, staff, and student interaction. And I think the rise of professional student life staff, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because they sure know a lot more about the rules and how things run than we did, but we had a dean of students and he had an assistant, and we didn't have a director of Greek life, and they ran everything. And so the faculty and staff had to step up and sponsor more organizations. Our chapter advisors, I think, had a more active role than our faculty and staff advisors for our Greek organizations do now, because now we have James, so they don't need another adult. And with the other student organizations, and I cannot remember who the faculty sponsor for Habitat for Humanity was, but there was one. Mm-hmm. And the faculty sponsors had to be much more active. It was also not uncommon to see faculty, young faculty, out at the fraternity parties. They didn't stay late, but they made an appearance, and they came by and spoke to people, and were just more active more visible. And Camptown, we had a big party weekend of bluegrass music, and it moved. In my first year, it was in the back of Mary Branch, and then it was over here by the Science Building. But Camptown was always a big deal, and we'd have bluegrass bands in all day and sit on the grass and listen to bluegrass and drink beer, and the faculty were always there. They didn't stay all day, but they were there part of the day. And so that was important. And I feel like we were in the faculty's homes more than students are now. I'm not sure about that. But I know the classics, I was a classics minor, and they're going to get me for not remembering the name, but there's the honorary fraternity for classics, whatever it is. Dr. Doherty or Dr. McCaffrey always had us out to their house for dinner and cooked a big Greek fancy dinner. Mrs. McCaffrey makes the most fabulous Greek food. It's just fabulous. So they always had us out, and B.J. Seymour always had all the majors to her house, and she doesn't cook. Never cooked. So that was always kind of an adventure. Was BJ going to try to cook for you, or was pizza being delivered? Because she did not cook. But she still had us in her home. And I don't think we do as much of that anymore either. And Dr. Brock's, we were always at Dr. Brock's house. After every concert, we were at Dr. Brock's house.
Did they live closer? I know a lot of faculty commute more.
Yeah, Dr. McCaffrey lived on Mullen, in one of the faculty houses in Mullen at that time. Dr. Doherty lives in Elmont, still does. It's the coolest house in Elmont. They were renovating it at the time. They bought an old schoolhouse, a 4-room schoolhouse.
Oh, wow.
And it is just, I don't know how I don't have the vision to walk into a schoolhouse and figure out how to make it a house. They do. It's fabulous. BJ didn't live in town. We had to drive into Richmond.
Okay.
But we did it. And yeah, Dr. Brock lived within walking distance. We could walk. So I think that probably is different. There aren't that many faculty that live here in Ashland anymore.
Was there much diversity on campus in the 80s, or was it still?
It was pretty lily white.
Yeah.
There were some African American. There wasn't anywhere near the international presence that there is now. I'm sure we had some international students, but I surely cannot think of one. I know we had some African American students, but it was not a significant presence. And I can name a couple, but because it wasn't a big deal, but it was when I look back, I think, wow, we were really, really a homogeneous group.
Did people stay on campus on the weekends mostly, or was there a lot of going into Richmond or DC or those kinds of activities?
There was a lot of going into Richmond and coming back. There wasn't going into Richmond and spend the weekend. There was a lot of going into the clubs and back out, or into the movies or things like that. But my memory is that mostly everybody was around on the weekends, and that may have just been my group. There may have been more of a suitcase campus in other parts of the college, but my dorm was generally always there.
Okay. So I guess moving on to more of like the religious activities on campus, was there much religious diversity, or was there a strong Methodist presence that you felt, or not so much?
Not so much. I didn't look in the catalog to see what it was when I was here. My memory is that United Methodist was probably still the highest denomination, but I think there were more Catholic students than there were.
That's what I read. It was actually majority Catholic.
Yeah, I think there were more Catholic students. It was a Christian college. I mean, Amy was Jewish. Can't think of anybody else. And I there were a few Jewish students, and I remember that the Ungers used to invite them home for important Jewish holidays, and they would, which I thought was also really lovely.
Professor Unger?
Mm-hmm. Professor Unger would have students to his house for High Holy Days, because it was such a small group and they didn't want them forgotten. There was an attempt by Duncan Memorial to have a presence on campus. The pastor at Duncan Memorial when I was here was Jim Boyce. His wife Emily worked the circulation desk in the library, and he was himself a Randolph-Macon alum, so he had a lot of connections with the college. And so they tried to have like a Sunday school class, but I don't recall that anybody ever actually went to it. I attended Duncan Memorial during my student years. My parents moved back to California the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, and I moved my membership to Duncan because I needed to keep my membership in the Virginia Conference because my scholarship was tied to the Virginia Conference. And I attended pretty regularly. My roommate was Townie, and she was my roommate, so she lived here, but she lived on campus, but her family lived here in Richmond, or here in Ashland, and had long links to the school. She's a Robertson, but she was a Simpson, the Simpson Mace, and her name's on the mace.
Okay.
Of one of the 19 members of the Simpson family that attended Randolph-Macon. And so her family had a lot of ties to the area, and her family attended Duncan, and so she usually went with me, and there'd be 5 or 6 students that I knew that were there on Sunday mornings. My scholarship, I had 2 scholarships. I came before the honors program. They had there was the Randolph-Macon Academic Scholarship and the Randolph-Macon Honors Scholarship or something like that. I don't know. One was a half tuition scholarship and one was a third tuition scholarship. And I had the half tuition scholarship, and then the other half of my tuition was paid in a pre-ministerial fund, and you were given half your tuition with the understanding that you would serve in a church-related vocation for an equal number of years. So when I graduated, having accepted it for 4 years, I owed the Methodist Church 4 years of service, which is why it was important to keep my membership in the Virginia Conference, because that was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. So the scholarship was through the church or through the college or both?
I was looking in the catalog today to try to figure that out. And it was through the church, or it was through the college, but you did sign this promissory note. And I remember when I graduated, I had to apply to the church to have it deferred. So I guess my assumption, it was really a Virginia Conference scholarship that our financial aid office just administered.
Okay.
And you had to be recommended for it, and you had to have a letter from your home congregation recommending you for it. And then when you went to work for the church, you sent a letter in every year telling them where you were employed. And that had to be signed by your church.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I sent those to the church. You didn't send those back here. Macon didn't, once you graduated, Macon didn't care. So it must have really been through the Virginia Conference.
Okay. Do you recall very many students that had this scholarship?
No. I had one. Beth had one. Beth Melton. think in the class of 84, Beth Melton and I were the pre-ministerial scholarship students. Hank Matthews was a year ahead of me, and Hank never did end up going into the ministry, so I don't, someday when I run into Hank, I'll have to say, what happened? Did they ever get the money back? How did that work? Beth and I both did our service, so
okay.
I don't know. And I don't know of anybody else from our class who had one, and I don't know of anybody else from my class who went into church service.
Okay. I was going to ask how many pre-ministerial students you thought there might have been in your class.
I think in my class there were just 2, I think, and at the college I think there were 6 or 7. I mean, it was a very small group.
Okay.
And Beth and I are not ordained. Beth and I both went into educational ministry, and I know that's a big difference with the Bailey scholars. They have to be on the ordination track, and we did not have to be. We just had to be in a church-related vocation.
Okay. Do you remember how many people majored in religion or were in the department? Was it a very popular major?
It wasn't a huge major. There were a lot of people majoring in religion who were not interested in church work.
Okay.
There were, I think there were 8 or 9 of us that majored in religion in my class. I'd have to pull the commencement bulletin because it lists, I think it lists your degree, and count. But there were 8 or 9, and I don't think Beth, who was the other pre-ministerial, I don't think she was a religious studies major. I don't remember.
Okay. And you said you and some students attended Duncan. Do you recall any faculty members that attended Duncan?
Yeah, you would always run into faculty over there. Well, Ira Andrews was the dean of students while I was here, and he is a Methodist clergy, as well as, and now he's retired. So do you know him? Did he retire before you came? Because then he taught, after he retired from being dean of students, he taught in the religion department. But at any rate, Ira was a big force. The Brock family, that was their family church. Some of them who are still attending, Brian Morse attended there. I think Al Acey attended there. So there you would see a lot of the faculty, not a lot, but there were always 4 or 5 faculty members that you would see.
Okay. And some alumni from previous classes have said, some faculty would lead Bible studies or be involved in religious organizations on campus. I think that was more in the 40s. Did you see any of that in the 80s or any remnants of it?
Not really. They were involved peripherally, like with the worship at noon, because we'd call on them to preach, or the folks that were ordained. Willie Chappell would preach for us a lot. But Willie Chappell and Dean Andrews would also do communion, because you have to have an ordained person to do communion. Okay. And they were always happy to serve when called on. And we'd get lots of different speakers. I mean, people from different, not just the religious studies types, would preach. We would get, the math professor or the physics professor, whoever you would round up to preach. And local pastors came in, and not just Methodist, but we would invite the local Baptist pastor, and we'd invite lots of other people in.
Was there a Baptist group or a Catholic group, and would you ever partner with different organizations?
There was a group of Catholic students there was a group of Baptist students. They didn't do things on campus. They got picked up.
Okay.
Now St. Anne's was at St. Anne's. I mean, it was at the corner, and the Catholic students could walk up to the corner. That was an active living congregation.
Mm-hmm.
The Smiths belonged to it. I can't remember. There were a couple faculty members who belonged to St. Anne's.
Mm-hmm.
And I was aware that the Catholic students were going to a cookout, or the Catholic students were going to this or that. St. Anne's was doing a spaghetti dinner for the Catholic students. And the same thing with the Baptist church that's out off 54. They would pick students up on Sunday nights for supper, and they would, and so I was, but there wasn't a Baptist group on campus per se. There was a church that shepherded the current Baptist students.
Okay. Do you recall the Duncan, even though chapel was no longer mandatory, it was still considered the college chapel?
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall it being used for anything aside from matriculation?
Actually, we didn't matriculate.
Oh.
Our matriculation was discontinued, and I'd have to go look at the books. It was discontinued in the early 70s. I think they thought it was too establishment and it was reestablished in 84, 85. So one of the things I always tell freshmen when they come through orientation and we have the first matriculation book out is, I'm not in there. And it bothers me. I'm going to sneak in one day and sign it.
Yeah.
Because I'm not in there. We did use Duncan for, well, we did all our chorus not all. We did chorus concerts in Duncan, smaller ones.
Okay.
We did lessons and carols in Duncan. We did an Easter service in Duncan. Did we do other stuff that was school related? I mean, FIMU still initiates in Duncan. They still allow us to use the sanctuary. I don't know if any of the other Greek organizations use it or not, but they still allow us to initiate in the sanctuary. But I don't, other than lessons and carols, I don't remember anything else.
So moving back to the Methodist presence at Randolph-Macon, some students today will say, it is the oldest chartered Methodist college, but it doesn't really feel like a Methodist college. When you were a student, do you recall any restrictions or policies or anything that was influenced by the Methodist Church, or anything that the Methodist Church had an influence on, or a presence that you could feel or see?
I think the Methodist Church has always had a presence because of the makeup of our Board of Trustees. The Methodist bishop is always a member of our Board of Trustees. There's always a couple of Methodist ministers on our Board of Trustees. The bishop when I was coming up was Bishop Goodson, and I adored Bishop Goodson. He was fabulous. He was also a huge personality, so anywhere Bishop Goodson was, you were aware that Bishop Goodson was there. Our current bishop, who is a really lovely lady, is just a much calmer, quieter presence. I don't think she dominates the way that Bishop Goodson did, and that's just a personality thing. Mm-hmm. So I think there was some of that. I would guess that the average student would tell you the same thing then that they tell you now, that yeah, we're Methodist, but it doesn't really mean anything. I was aware of a lot of things because there has always been a tension. The Methodist Church is a dry church. Randolph-Macon allows alcohol on their campus, and there's always been a tension with that. And I was generally a student or young adult member of the annual conference, and it often came up at annual conference that Randolph-Macon's having all these wild parties, and it's this really wild place, and we need to either shut it down or disaffiliate with it or something. And so I was always very aware of that. But other than discussions about the alcohol policy, I don't remember a lot of other things that would be Methodist related. The Methodist Church has always been pretty diverse and pretty accepting, and so it's not, it wouldn't be typical of a Methodist college to try to shut down the Baptists or the Catholics or anybody from coming in, because that's just not, we're a very ecumenical denomination, and we're a very evangelical denomination in the meaning of, as long as it gets the gospel out there, it's a good thing. So if we're not going to try to convince Catholic students that they're wrong.
Okay. So what do you think has kept the relationship between the church and the college going? I mean, in your opinion, is it more just a historical significance, or I guess what has kept them from disaffiliating with the college?
I think it is that. I think it is the long history. But tied to the long history is the alumni base. And although we no longer turn out all these ministers who go to Randolph-Macon and then Duke and then come back to the Virginia Conference and run the Virginia Conference, they're still out there. And I know when it would come up that we needed to disaffiliate, this would start running through the conference, then all the Randolph-Macon alums would sit together and vote as a block and make it just really well known that we were there. And we were there because of Randolph-Macon, and you can't discount that. So I think that the alumni base, and it's not just the clergy, because I'm not clergy, or the really active Methodists, professional church types, but the lay people who are active in their local Methodist churches who were students here. And there's lots of them. And then there are some other Methodist ties. There, Estes Dining Hall. Ed Estes did not attend Randolph-Macon College. He was not an alum. He was a Methodist clergy, or not clergy, he was a Methodist layperson. He owned a car dealership, who was looking for a way to support the church and chose to do that here. Frank Brown for whom the campus center is named and who was a major donor, was a Methodist layperson who was looking for a place to support the church and did it through education. So I think there's those ties as well that the Methodist Church wants to honor.
I guess so moving on from that, now you're back at Randolph-Macon.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what brought you back here and what you do now?
Mm-hmm. Well, what brought me back here has nothing to do with what I do now. What brought me back here, my husband is also a Randolph-Macon alum, and he and I graduated in 1984. One of the stories that we do like to tell, and I don't know if you've ever seen our wedding picture in front of the fountain. It's up on my thing. And we were married by Ira Andrews in Duncan Memorial. And we had our reception in the campus center. We had the Randolph-Macon wedding. I mean, it just, it was, and my wedding was yellow, which was not on purpose. I didn't think about that until later. But it really had to do with my roommate saying, I will not wear a pink dress. Okay, we'll do a different color. Julia, what do you want to be? And we actually got married the week after we graduated, having spent all of May in England with the choir. Wow. And we came back May 22nd, graduated May 28th, married June 2nd. I mean, it was just boom, 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 boom. Wow. But we did, when I graduated, I went to the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, which is now part of Union Theological Seminary. And then I did 15 years of local church work with different. First church I worked for was Lutheran, and then after that I've worked for Methodist churches, with different Methodist churches in different areas. And when we graduated, Ed did a couple of things and then ended up in the family insurance business, but eventually he went back to school and got his PhD and began to teach. And so when we were living in North Carolina, he was teaching at North Carolina Wesleyan, and I was the director of student religious life at North Carolina Wesleyan, when he got the opportunity to come back up here. And so we moved back up here in 2001. Right? Yeah. And I worked at the Hermitage Home, which is a Methodist retirement home in the North Side, for a year. And then this archives position opened up, and I applied for it. And I've been here, 5 years, something like that. It's a really interesting position for me because I'm not library or archivally trained. My training is in Christian education and theology. But the decision was made when they were hiring, and I later ran into apparently my big competition for the position, didn't know it at the time, who was archivally trained, and they decided it was easier to teach somebody to do the archiving stuff than it was to teach them the Methodist history. And obviously, because I love my job, I think that was a good decision, but I think that's probably also true. Our Methodist collection is huge and diverse and covers an amazing amount of stuff. We have handwritten minutes of the annual conference from 1800 that are signed by John Early and Francis Asbury and David Doggett and all of these luminaries of the Methodist Church. And I think if you weren't Methodist, you wouldn't understand how important this stuff is. And I think just the rise in the number of inquiries and such that we've had and we've been able to answer here kind of points to the importance of having somebody who understands the Methodist part, because it's just the history of the Methodist Church is confusing because we have been so many other things before we've only been the United Methodist Church since 1968. We've been the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and we've been in the Virginia Conference, but parts of Virginia have been in the Baltimore Conference, and parts of Virginia have been in the Holston Conference, and just try to sort it all out. You have to be able to stop and think, okay, place in history. Okay, when they're looking for this person, that church would have been. And we have maps and we have notes and we have ways to figure that out. You don't have to just know it. And I didn't know a lot of it, but it's helpful to speak the Methodist vocabulary to do the job. And we do have, we have this amazing collection. Our Methodist collection is a combination of several things. But basically, we hold the archives for the Virginia Annual Conference. The Virginia Conference does have their own archive, and they actually just hired a new archivist, and she's a lovely lady named Stephanie. But their collection, it's a tenth of the size of ours. They just don't have what we have. A lot of what we have probably should have belonged to the conference and did at one time, and then it got intermixed into the McGraw-Page, well, it's just McGraw at the time, or just Page at the time, the Page Library collection. And if we ever had to sort it out now, what was theirs and what was ours, I don't know, we'd all just commit suicide. It would be really hard. And then we also have the Peyton collection, which is a separate Methodist collection, which is held separately. We can tell you exactly what's Peyton. But is again another large collection of Methodist material. And just documents an amazing amount of history.
That's great. So I guess just wrapping up, is there any favorite memory of Randolph-Macon that you have, or favorite story that you'd like to leave us with?
You know, I've asked people that and asked people that, and I have no idea. I think my best memories of Randolph-Macon, I mean, my favorite things that I did were my travel terms. And those were very meaningful, and I just wouldn't give up traveling for anything. I encourage all of our students to travel while you have the opportunity, because then you graduate and then you don't get to do it anymore.
It's a shame.
It is a shame. Well, I've been back to England, but that was I went back to England 2 years ago. It was the first time I'd been out of the country since college.
Wow.
So those were probably my favorite classes, and my best memories are probably actually just tied up in hanging out with my friends, hanging out in Mary Branch, sitting on the steps of Mary Branch, drinking frozen fruit beverages that we made in blenders in the hall, and just doing nothing.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.